In this conversation, we'll explore some of the tensions around the construct of words called there's a fine line between genius and insanity. So in order to explore kind of this territory, we begin with the circle, with the uninterrupted whole, the integrated, united ecology, which is in unconscious territory. It's far too big and far too simple to penetrate with language. In order to enter the domain of the uninterrupted whole, we have to cut the one into two with polarity and with language. And because there's an infinite number of distinctions from here to here and from here to here, and you can see that if you just keep cutting things in half. You can cut it in half, you can cut it in half, you can cut it in half, you can cut that in half. There's an infinite number of distinctions between any two distinctions, certainly between any two polarities. And this again enters unconscious territory, right? Because we cannot comprehend, we cannot put infinity into language in a practical sense. We can say the word, but we can't experience infinity. We can only experience a small set of distinctions through the framework of language, be it mathematical language or verbal language. And so in order to relate to this duality created by language, we create a grid where we somewhat arbitrarily agree that there will be a certain number of distinctions, like that every foot, for example, a foot is an arbitrary number. And then we repeat, now we say it's 2 feet. But why a foot, right? Because that increment can be an infinite size. It could be a billionth of a foot. It could be a billion feet, right? It's an arbitrary increment that has some relationship to the human body, right? So we pick an increment and then we repeat it, right? And the increment is not so small that we get lost and overwhelmed by small variations and distinctions. And it's not so big that it has no relationship to our own body and our own world. And so this is a grid. It's a grid of mathematical language. It's a grid of verbal language. And then we create another, a vertical grid. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to pinpoint places within the one, right? Because we can go to the intersection. In the same way that we give an address, there's an infinite number of spaces. So why don't we just say, go to the 3,000th tree and, stand where the, 30,000th leaf has fallen, right? It's overwhelming, right? And so we just say, go to the corner of, 4th and Broadway, and we can find a location, a crude location, but we can get into the general area that matters. And that's what we do with mathematics, and that's what we do with language. Now, every cult, every culture agrees on a framework of mathematical language and verbal language as a way of locating certain memes, right, that are prominent within that cult, within that culture. And, and what defines the cult is the unquestioning the unquestioning entry into those two languages. For example, we have a 10-point number system, so we go 9, 10, and then 1, 2, 3, and then we repeat 11, 12. So we repeat a 10-point number system, which is completely arbitrary. We could have a 32-point number system, we could have a 5-point number system, but we all agree on the cult of a 10-point number system. And a 10-point number system creates a probability field and a possibility field that is possible within that number system. It's a different probability field, a different possibility field than a 3-point number system, a 5-point number system, or a 1 billion point number system where you go up to where you have a billion separate characters and then you repeat. Now, similarly with words, right? We create a word system where we break reality into roughly 60,000 words, many of them largely synonymous, right? So, maybe 20,000 or so distinct ideas that each have a symbol of a word or more, right? Because we can say you, we can say thou, we can say he, we can say she. There's a lot of synonyms. But we create a grid that delineates illusionary partitions in language. Now you get to belong to the system. You get to belong to the cult that utilizes that system by learning the language of numbers and words, and by learning the emphasis, the priorities of a given cult, right? So we have a tremendous priority on money, for example. If you look at 90% of all human behavior in the cults that are present today, you can see that it has a strong relationship with money. What people are not doing things that cost them a lot of money, and they're doing things that make them a lot of money or allow them to hang on to it. And so you can see that as a present meme, right? It's given that you need to make money, you need to have money. Money is a good thing. Money will buy this, will buy that, etc. And so but of course, if you were only one member of a cult that was obsessed with money, it would have no value, right? Because you'd say, oh, I want all the money. You just take it, right? Because nobody else is interested in it. You have all this paper, you have all this gold, and it doesn't buy anything, right? Because you'd go and say, I'll give you this paper for your daughter's hand in marriage, right? That's a typical payment system throughout much of human culture. Is you buy someone with a dowry of some kind, and they're like, well, we're not into paper. We're not into we don't even understand what you're talking about. But that's not what we do. What we do is we follow threads of joy, right? As different things bring joy, right? And the things that bring joy, music, dancing, that's what we respond to. So the best dancer, the best musician, the one that makes my daughter smile the most, well, that's the person that we're interested in. And, take your paper somewhere else. Now, if everyone is doing that, then dance and music, of course, becomes elevated as a currency of value, as something meaningful, and nobody worries about paper. People worry about dancing. And the reason to grow food is to develop a healthy body in order to be a better dancer, right? So it's a different currency. It's a different meme. It's a different thought, a different value hierarchy. Now, the memes of our cult are what they are. The languages of our cult, the 10-point number system, the delineation of words are what they are. And they create a network, right? A network of people that use those two languages, the number language, the verbal language, in this case English, and agree that, we'll all pursue certain things, right? Fame, money, being handsome or pretty, being well educated, i.e. going to a university and doing the things that get good marks there, which again are very arbitrary. If you analyze what is taught in school and then analyze what would be most useful to know to live a good life. Well, if you ask, what would be most useful to live a good life, you might say learning to cook delicious food, not taught in school, learning to have amazing orgasmic sex and not catch diseases and only have children when you're ready to, again, not taught in school, learning to resolve conflict and create deep and meaningful friendships, not even mentioned in school, and the ability to create shared cooperatives where you each discover your abilities and your talents. You bring those into the group in a synergistic way, and you create massive amounts of value for each group member and deep fulfillment by expressing and sharing one's gifts. And again, in education, there's very little attention to the gifts of each individual. And there's a limited set of subjects that often have very little to do with personal or global well-being, right? You might also learn how to attend to your environment in such a way that you leave the topsoil in your agriculture in a healthier condition than when you found it, that you have a wide diversity of species that are beautiful to look at, but also that create a lower maintenance ecology. When you have an ecology that is in perfect balance, you don't need to do anything, right? The weather system is not terribly volatile. You don't have too many mosquitoes. You don't have too many spiders. That all balances itself out in a wonderful cycle, right? But of course, we don't learn about that either, right? What we learn about are some standardized subjects that were outlined a few hundred years ago that don't necessarily even have much to do with how much of an income you're likely to make in today's economy, as evidenced by the high student debt that many people have a hard time paying off. And so it's important to understand that whether it's the language in mathematics or verbal or the education system or how people are supposed to behave, that it's all somewhat cult-like, meaning there is not a strong rational basis for arriving at any of those norms. However, you have a very strong network, and a network is, created by a majority, right? So you see that kind of in a bell curve. So if you take the majority of people in our network, you have a very large number of people, at least 80% of people that are talking the same language, they're talking the same mathematical language, they're agreeing to focus on the same things, and they're agreeing to standardized protocols. And that's the framework, that's the basis for connection to the network, right? Now, the problem with any of these networks, the problem with any system, is that it doesn't touch all points in reality. And what I mean by that is, if you want to touch this area right here, let's call this the loneliness epidemic or the depression epidemic. If you want to touch this area right here, you can do these grids, 100 times. You can state them 1,000 different ways, but you're never going to touch that particular area because it doesn't intersect with the system as it's been outlined, right? So this particular grid doesn't touch large sections of the possibility of the probability field. And in order to touch them, you have to go out of the system and you have to develop a new system that happens to intersect with them, right? So there is a system that intersects with them. There's a system of language, there's a system of mathematics that does intersect those 2 points, but they don't intersect other points, right? So the system that intersects with these 2 points does not intersect with this point over here, right? So the problem with any system is it has blind spots. And the blind spots are the areas it can't see, it can't relate to, it can't touch. Every language, whether it's a number, a numerical language, or whether it's a verbal language, misses certain areas of time and space, certain areas in the possibility field that's represented by the sphere, and hits others, right? And so in order to touch the areas that are not being touched by our cult, we've got to go into a new number system, a new language, a new language of numbers, a new language of words. And we have to go into a new cult, a new culture. We have to step outside of the standardized norms and look through the lens of values that are not being looked at. And then suddenly we see clearly. We see all the things we couldn't see through the old way, right? And it's no different than saying, in order to look at this side here, right, I have to shut this eye and I have to open this eye, right? And then I can look here. And then to look over here, I have to look, shut this eye and look over here, right? And so when you have a cult where everyone is agreeing to think the same way, to see the same way, through the same lenses of the same language, you have a very powerful network. Now, the beauty of a network is it reinforces and develops itself. It doesn't matter if it's a 5-point number system or English or some other language. It reinforces itself, right? So everyone in the network, is agreeing to think about certain things in a certain way. Even if there's division within the network, they've agreed on the division, right? So they're going to split the division. There may be in our network a division between the pro-life and the pro-choice, for example, frameworks, right? You have to choose, are you pro-life or are you pro-choice? Right. But that's part of the cult. As soon as you step outside of that, you might say you're pro-intuition or you're anti-intuition. In other words, you might say that it's not about pro-life or pro-choice, you're pro-intuition. And if the people involved have an intuition that a given pregnancy should be facilitated, then they facilitate it. And if they have an intuition that a given pregnancy should not be brought to full, to full fruition and birth, that they don't, right? So that's a completely different, we're not even asking that, right? Because we're in the scientific paradigm where intuition is ranked quite low, right? So we're trying to argue it within that paradigm. Or you might look at it in another paradigm, which is what's likely, statistically likely, to make people the happiest. And if you look at the statistics, if you gather statistics of everyone at different ages and different circumstances, like this would be a rational approach if you believe in the scientific method, you might say, okay, anyone who has a child who's making less than $100 a month, tends to be miserable, and the child is brought up miserably 99% of the time. And anyone who has a child making more than $5,000 a month has a 50-50% chance of improving their happiness or feeling worse. You have a 90% chance of losing sleep, or a 95% chance if you have a child under any circumstances, right? And so you go through the statistics and you say, we're committed to happiness, and for your own good, we will terminate the pregnancy if the data lines up that you've got a 99, anything over 75%, we'll take action for you. In other words, if you're having a child and there's a 75% statistical probability that you should have the child, then you have to have the child whether you want to or not. And if there's a 75% statistical probability that you and the child will be miserable, you cannot have the child whether you want to or not. Because we're not focused on freedom and choice and the individual. No. We're focused on happiness using the scientific method. And that obviously, right? If there's a 75, nobody should, we don't encourage people to go off to the casino with 75% odds of losing money, right? If we want them to make money, no. So it's about doing what's right scientifically. And so you'd follow that pattern, right? But that would be a different cult, right? So we're in the cults that frame things as we frame things. We first of all frame what are the important questions, and then we frame what are the two choices. And they're a speck of all the questions that could be asked and all the ways those choices could be framed, right? Because when we say we're pro-life, we're not talking about the quality of life, right? When someone makes less than $100 a month and is an addict and doesn't have, a competent skill to take care of the child, when we say we're pro-life, we're not saying we're excited about what that child's life is likely to be. And when we're talking about an individualistic cult, we're not saying we're going to come in and raise that child the way it ought to be raised. We're saying the child has a right to live, even if it's a horrible life. And so you can't, have an abortion if you're pro-life, right? So it's framed as pro-life, but it might also be pro-children at all costs, right? Or it might be pro-amount of lives that are, regardless of how miserable they are. So you could say you're pro-happiness, right? But that's a more complex thing because, some people are very happy that they've had an abortion, and some people are very unhappy that they haven't, right? But all of this takes us into what's called the weeds, right? We want to stay crisp and clear within the cult guidelines of what we're supposed to think about in the way that we're supposed to think about it, right? And so that creates the network. Now, you can think of a network as, for example, the cable network, right? The cable network, first of all, is standardized around coaxial cable, right? So there are a few different sizes and a few different fittings, but largely, like if you're in the United States and you say, I want a cable wire, I want coaxial cable, it will come in a certain size, it'll have a certain fitting, and if you plug it in, certain things will happen. And so the benefit of being part of a network, like the cable network, is that it will work. It will connect you with movies and information and internet throughout an entire area. So you have a very wide connectivity if you join the network. And the network has a protocol, right? The protocol is the language, right? In the cable network, you have the transmission language, the receiving language, the electrical language, right? What's the voltage? What's the amplitude of the signal? How is it sent? How is it received? Now, if you send a signal and there's no receiver, no information is transmitted. If you didn't get that, right? You may have gotten some sounds, but you didn't get the meaning because I'm not using the protocol, right? If I use English, there's a very wide network of people that can receive the data in that protocol of sound. It's arbitrary. It's arbitrary. You can make any sound associated with anything, and you can say it in any order, right? But English dictates the order arbitrarily, and it dictates the sounds that are associated with each point that's trying to be, communicated on its carrier wave, which is sound. Sound within certain frequencies that the ear can process. Now, if I send sound on frequencies that nobody can process, then the sound and the information may be superior. It may be more detailed, more relevant, better organized, better prioritized, but nobody gets it, right? Because it's not in the English network. And so, that's the tension, right? So, when we talk about, to go back to our point, the fine line between genius and insanity. First of all, it's important to understand that the grid, that the networks that we belong to, the cults that we adhere to, are only touching 1%, let's say, of the probability of the possibility field. And what that means is that 99% of the probability field of the possibility field that is available to us if we used different systems, if we developed different languages, different cultural languages, verbal languages, and mathematical languages. 99% of those probabilities are not available to us. They don't show up, and they certainly aren't highlighted within our network. And so you could say they lie in the unknown, which also means they lie in the unconscious. So the word Zinge, right, has a meaning in some language, somewhere in some probability field, but not here, right? It's in the unknown. And its meaning, if people knew the meaning of that word in a particular language, it could be incredibly relevant to certain people in their lives right now. But they don't know it, and they don't know that they don't know it, right? It's not real. It's not within people's probability field. It's in the unknown. Now, what this means is that, all the medical cures, all the ecological cures, all the depression, all the loneliness, all the deteriorating friendships, all the political strife, all the corruption is all resolved, doesn't exist when viewed through a different set of languages and a different set of protocols that don't result in them, right? So whenever you create a protocol, you create a probability field. And the probability field is expressed mathematically in the reality, right? So how many politicians are corrupt in using this metric? How many politicians are corrupt using this metric? In this system, right? Now, if you use a different system, how many politicians are corrupt using this metric and this metric in this other system, right? So every time you change the variables in a protocol, you get a different result. You get a different probability field, meaning every variable that we change, like let's say you take the average size of a country and you cut it in half so that there are twice as many countries in the world. Let's say you take the average town and you cut it from 4,000 people to 2,000 people, right? You create 2 towns. You will have a different probability field as a result of having a smaller number of people sharing a group identity. One of the things that is affected is intimacy, right? If you have 150 people in a group, you know each other very, very well. Everyone knows each other in a sustaining group of 150 people. If you have a 5,000 person group, you do not know each other, right? So the smaller the group, the more intimacy, the more knowledge about each member in the group, by every member of the group. And so if you look through the paradigm of positive intention and goodwill, the more you know, the more you are enabled to do goodwill. If you look through the paradigm or the belief that people are fundamentally bad, then you will see that there is more and more harm the smaller the people, because people can see each other more clearly to cause more harm. And the data suggests that the smaller the group of people, the more neighborly, the more friendly, the more safe people are. In small towns, in small villages, there's a lot more friendliness than in large cities, right? So it's suggesting that small is beautiful, to use a particular cult meme. And so if you make groups smaller, you could say that relationships might improve. But if you're looking at digital efficiencies or theoretical efficiencies, you might say that to make groups bigger would be more efficient, right? If you could have a bigger company, it would be more efficiently than 5 smaller companies. And so the company should get bigger, even as relationships deteriorate as a result of getting bigger and having less intimacy, right? So these are all, and this is all happening within, our current lens of culture and language. But, if you use Cat5 Ethernet cable to connect your network, and you bring a Cat27 cable and plug it in, it doesn't work, right? Because it doesn't fit the port. And so it doesn't matter that it's many times faster, many times superior. It may even be cheaper to do 27 cables out of a different material, maybe fiber or whatever it is. It's failing. It's failing to connect with the network. So what genius does is it goes into the unknown, masters it, learns about it, and brings it back into the known in a way that facilitates well-being, right? When you cure a disease, by the very fact that the disease is happening and nobody wants to suffer, it means that there's a blind spot. It means that people don't know how to cure the disease. If they did, they would. Certainly, even in an individualistic cult, if you're in pain with a disease and you know how to snap your finger and the pain goes away, then everyone snaps their fingers. Now, if you're in a cult that is an individualistic cult and a disease costs $50,000 to cure and you only have $1,000, and other people would have to spend their own money and in that paradigm they would have less, then maybe people do not snap their fingers and get rid of your disease, right? Because you don't have enough to get rid of it, and other people don't want to have less in a paradigm where they have less and you have more, in an either-or paradigm. Then it looks like they're going backwards within that lens, rather than it looking like they get to be around healthy people in their community, which would look like going forward, right? But it all depends on the lens through which you view things. So by the very nature of a new problem, of a new discovery, it lies in the unknown. But you can't get into the unknown using the same things that are already known, right? So you have to venture into the unknown, number one. You have to hit the target, the goal, in this case, to cure a certain disease. And then you have to bring it back into the known. And then you have to guide other people into the unknown to repeat the process. And the results have to be verified, right? And so then you're a genius, right? So you go into the unknown. You find something useful. You then bring other people into the unknown, predictably, and they also find something useful, and then you're a genius. So that's how you become a genius, is you leave the current system, you leave where it's taking you, which is where you already are, and you go into the unknown. And since 99% of reality is unknown, you may very well miss it, right? You may get within a foot, right? But you're in invisible territory. You can't see it through your language, through your lens. You may miss it this way, you may miss it this way, you may miss it this way, and then later, 100 years later, someone else may hit it, right? So you were going in the right direction, but you couldn't see clearly. You couldn't get the positive result. You didn't know how close you were, and so you miss it, right? And so, why is it that in the search of genius, that in the penetration of the unknown, that so many people go insane, right? Well, there's a couple of reasons, right? The first is you've got to get rid of a lot of assumptions in order to go into the unknown. Because if you use the same system, the same protocols, and the same assumptions as everyone else to go into the unknown, you're not going to end up in the unknown. You're going to end up where everyone else ends up, which happens to be the known, right? So that's not where you want to end up. Now, 99% of reality is in the unknown. And if you end up, in this percent and this percent, it's not useful, right? It's only useful if you hit the goal, find something and bring it back, or hit something else that you discover that's useful, which happens a lot, meaning the old story of 3M where they were trying to develop a certain type of glue and they couldn't develop that glue, but it turned out that the glue that they did develop created Post-it notes, right? And so Post-it notes took off. Nobody knew that there was a market for Post-it notes. Nobody was trying to create Post-it notes. They were trying to create a particular type of adhesive. And it just so happened that while they were trying to do one thing, they found the adhesive that's good for Post-it notes. And so you can pull it off and stick it on something, and that took off, right? And the original goal, they were unsuccessful, right? So that also happens, when you enter such a vast territory as the unknown, is you've got no system, so you're wandering around. Or maybe you've got a system that within the system, that it's somewhere in this quadrant, but you could spend 50 years and never stumble across just the right thing. You just know it's somewhere in here. And so you have a feeling it's in here, and you try getting at it like this, you miss it. You try getting at it like that, you miss it. You try getting it like that, you miss it. And usually your funders, your investors give up on you. They say, 3 strikes, you're out. We're done with you, right? Because you didn't hit the target in those first 3 times. And it could be that the 4th one would hit it, or the 5th one, or the 6th one, or it could be the best thing is to flail around in here, to just flail around. There's different patterns that are likely to hit certain things. It's very much like looking for a sunken vessel, right? You create a grid and You try and think, where is it most likely to be sunk and what's the technology for detecting the metal? And then you start creating a pattern, right? And you hope you don't run out of money before you find the vessel. If you find the vessel by here, and it's costing you $10,000 a week to search for it, you make money because it has a certain amount of value. But if you start over here and your pattern goes to here, now even if you find the vessel, you've lost money because now there's $100,000 of gold buried in the hull of the boat. But at $10,000 a week starting here, you've spent $120,000 by the time you've got it, and so there's just so many of these things that are they're very risky. And in addition, the fear of the unknown is the greatest human fear, to be lost in the unknown. And to be lost in the unknown is to go insane, right? You lose language, you lose measuring, you lose the ability to connect with other people. Everyone else thinks you're crazy. Nobody else has any concept of what you're trying to do, and you are lost in the unknown, right? And you go insane, right? You start talking about paradigms that nobody can relate to. You don't have any money to realize them. You go insane. Now, meanwhile, you could stay on the network grid, right? You just connect right here. Here, everyone is, right? There's lots of money for research because they've already found the main things there. And so they hypothesize that that's a good place to be. Now, this is also the fallacy of cult and culture and, the tension, right? Because if you do what everyone else is doing, you have a pretty good odds of succeeding, right? But it's not going to work very well. But you have pretty good odds of succeeding, and you know what to look for, and you can usually find it, right? For example, if you're looking for gold, a very old quest, you can look on YouTube and you'll find that here in this riverbed there's a certain amount of gold, and so you can pretty reliably go there, and if you spend all day with your little pan, etc., you can get $100 worth of gold in a day, right, with your $500 of equipment, and you spend a whole day, and then you have to take the gold and smelt it and sell it, and you could make $50 a day in net profit doing that particular search. But that's an old search, right? Because people have been looking for gold in the ways that they've been looking for gold for a long time. But what if you want to look for Selidi, right? So first of all, what is it? I don't know. What's it used for? I don't know that either. Well, then how do we know we want to look for it? Well, we can't be sure, right? And where do we go to look for it? Well, we don't know that. And how do we find it? We don't know that either. But maybe we should go and look for Selidi. Now, if you take Selidi using another, a completely different grid system, you have to develop the grid system. You have to teach it to other people. Otherwise, you're a network of one and your cable doesn't plug into anyone else. Nobody else understands it. But let's say you find Selidi. You're the only one looking for it. You're the only one who knows how to find it. And you're the only one experimenting. So you're the first one to discover that Selidi cures cancer. So now you know why to look for it, because it cures cancer, which you stumbled on, right? You found this substance. You started trying to figure out what to do with it. And it turns out you gave it to your dog who had cancer, and the cancer disappeared. And so you thought, could be useful for that. But what about intuition? What if Selidi increased intuition, but you weren't looking for that, and you don't pay any attention to your intuitions, and so you tasted some Selidi, and you didn't know your intuitions were more accurate because you didn't test it, right? Because you're not paying attention to intuition, right? And so that's the kind of needle in the haystack that we're looking at when we go into unknown territory. So the odds are, right, in any system, and you can think of like the English language system and the scientific method, etc., as being kind of the dominant system of today. And you can see that, early on and initially the scientific method brought all kinds of value. It's kind of like wandering into a new apple orchard for the first time. There are what's called low-hanging fruit, right? This whole orchard of apples, and you taste one is absolutely delicious. You've never had an apple before, and it's incredible. So you want everyone to benefit from the apple. You call everyone over. They all pick the lower apples, and pretty soon it's harder to pick apples because everyone's picked the low apples. And so that's one problem. The second problem is too much of anything is toxic. And so you're now getting stuffed on apples, and you're not getting enough broccoli, enough grains, whatever. You're all getting stuffed on apple because apples is the next big thing. And then the third thing is hedonic adaptation kicks in. It's no longer the best fruit you've ever tasted in the whole world. It's just an apple. So by entering a system that propagates and brings apples into the mainstream, the main protocol of the cult, you simultaneously take all the low-hanging fruit, all the wild apples, they're the low-hanging fruit. The best tasting wild apples that you didn't have to plant are the lowest hanging fruit. The best tasting wild apples that you didn't have to plant that are up a little higher that you have to climb up is the next fruit. Then you get to the point where you have to start planting apple trees. Then you get to the point where you have to destroy other forests in order to plant apple trees so there's enough apples to meet the demand. And then you have to pick all of them, and then you have to ship them various places. By this point, it's not low-hanging fruit. That's the first thing. The second thing is apples are becoming boring. And the third thing is at some point on a diet of apples, they're not as healthy as a mixed diet, and so they become toxic, right? And so what you can see in the trajectory of a cult is that a cult forms around a new technology, a new protocol, a new discovery. And it increases the well-being of its people, right? So as a result, since everyone is seeking sustainable well-being and trying to avoid chronic and unnecessary suffering, people join the cult. More and more people join the cult, and they experience that greater sense of well-being. And then this threefold phenomena occurs where up at the peak of the cult, everyone is doing capitalism, everyone is doing communism, everyone is doing apples, whatever it is, and it's becoming harder to do. Hedonic adaptation is kicking in to make it less enjoyable to do it, and it's becoming toxic at some point. And the fear of the unknown and people's attachment to keep doing whatever it was that seemed to be working has them keep doing it and holding on to it. And relative to another cult, a new technology that then comes onto the scene, their well-being, as the cult kind of peaks, their well-being drops off. Meanwhile, there's a new cult, a new discovery. And the people that start doing that are now doing better. They're succeeding relative to the old. And so more and more people get onto that bandwagon. And as they do, that drops off. You can see this with universities, for example. So for a long time, nobody was educated. Then there were people that went to university and learned mathematics and Latin and various things, learned global history. And they became very valuable in their rarity. And so they got extra income, and were respected. So they got respect, sex, income, and power, all from having a university education. So then more and more people joined that particular bandwagon, and the rarity disappeared, hedonic adaptation disappeared, and now you didn't get more sex, more power, more money, and more insight and et cetera with a university education. What you got was more debt, and people don't really care whether you have a degree or not. They just want to know, can you get the job done? And getting the job done in some ways becomes more rare than someone who has a university degree, right? And so, but people hang on to the cult meme even as it goes into a downward slope, and a majority start going downhill, right? And that's the pivot point. When a majority of people are in more pain as a result of hanging on to their pattern, their identity, their protocol, while a new cult, a new pattern is taking off, that's usually the pivot point where people abandon the ship of the old cult and jump on the new thing. But the new thing generally, much like multi-level marketing, does best for the first people, and not so much by the time that everyone joins on, although there are exceptions, right? Because, going from a rotary phone to a cell phone is always going to be better than the rotary phone, up to a point, right? But then hanging on to the cell phone as we start moving into different brain transplant and, an implant type of technologies, or, the ability to send information directly to the brain in various ways. The people that hang on to the cell phones will be so much slower with the tapping versus the instant thought that the very thing that was an advancement becomes an impediment relative to the new thing. So I want to kind of close by looking at why insanity, right? So the genius is able to see past the limitations of the status quo, the dominant assumptions, to become a contrarian, a minority voice, to leave the system, to transcend the system, and to locate something that nobody else could find within the infinite possibility field, where everything exists. 99% of all reality exists in the unknown. However, in order to enter the unknown while transcending the status quo, the genius must weaken their certainty about the known, because the known doesn't take you there. So there is a weakening of the present values, the present protocols, the present languages, and the present rationality. So the current dominant system must fade into the background. One is then confronted with absolute chaos, an overwhelming possibility field, and one can easily get lost in that. Number two, as the genius knows with certainty that most treasures, in other words, 10,000 years from now, most of the things that people value the most do not exist, right? So 10,000 years from now, just like today, like if we look at today and we say, what do I value the most? My phone, my car, my computer, my network of friends around the world, whatever it is. 99% of that didn't exist 100 years ago. There was no phone, was no car, people didn't have it, there was no network of friends around the world, there was no internet, there was no ratings, There was no mobile banking. So 99% of what exists, then you look at the furniture, that didn't exist, the alloys didn't exist, YouTube didn't exist. None of this existed 100 years ago. 95% of what we're spending our time with doesn't exist just 100 years ago. And so 1,000 years from now, let alone 1,000,000 years from now, all of the things that our future self is dwelling on does not exist today. And in order to find it, we have to go into the unknown. And so a genius knows the value of the unknown. They know they're close. They can smell it. They can feel it. They know they're in the territory. And they also know that the unknown contains better things than the present. Faster, better, smoother, stronger. Things that cannot be imagined today. It was just 10 years ago when everyone on TV was saying that Elon Musk was going to fail, that electric cars were just a fad, that they couldn't be built, that if they nobody wanted them. 10 years later, Tesla is the dominant automaker in the world, pioneering the safest cars in the world that are growing faster than almost any brand. So what's impossible is desirable in the unknown, and a genius knows that. And so they're likely to throw out and to discount the people around them as they lead themselves into what can be a wild goose chase, right? Going around missing things, failing constantly, losing money, etc. But as you cling to something you cannot fully understand, right, you can discount too much what is known. So that's one way to go insane. Another way to go insane is to experience so much pain, loss, and failure as a result of the pursuit that it's not nice to come back to reality, that you drift more and more into delusion in order to justify the failed journey, right? So that's another temptation into the unknown. The third is we need a certain amount of order. We need a certain amount of a system that helps us understand in words what we know. And it's very hard to talk if nobody else understands. And so the very fact that we may, in fact, discover a beautiful new technology and a beautiful system for creating it, but the combination of being ostracized and rejected by the status quo, which almost invariably prefers mediocrity to excellence if it involves learning something new and facing the unknown. I mean, if you take 100 people that are getting by and you show them a dramatically better way, or you try to show them a better way of living, most people have no interest in learning what they don't know that they don't know. No interest whatsoever. And so the rejection of the known to the unknown technology and the rejection of the genius also creates a partition where it's now painful to experience that. And so there's a tendency to dissociate from pain, right? And if pain is associated with sanity, i.e. the system that everyone else is using, you can get lost in your own system that nobody else understands, and it's hard to maintain discipline and honesty and integrity in a system when you have no one else supporting the system on the outside. So what you could say then is that at any given point, the majority of people are late in the adoption process of a status quo protocol that is delivering a mediocre result, and that there's a small minority, like down here, that's on the cutting edge of a new technology, and the majority rejects it. And the challenge is, do you want to be part of a mature system that is not in too much threat of going crazy or being, isolated? Or do you want to be part of a virgin system where you're the first or one of three to discover it, where it has, large risks of unpredictability, but you might just give birth to something that's never been seen before, to something that in 1,000 years will be the most important thing for humanity. But right now, only 3 or 4 people on the planet can even grasp that it has any value at all, let alone knows how to speak that language or is willing and interested in stepping into that territory. And with that, we'll say goodbye.